Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the first video on the Nimzo-Indian series. This is going to be a full comprehensive series where we're going to cover every single Nimzo-Indian variation in great detail and hopefully get you ready to play this in any of your games. Now, this video is going to be simply introductory where I'm going to cover kind of the main ideas of the opening as a whole, as well as just introduce you to a couple of the variations just so you kind of get a glimpse of what this system is going to be like and so you can determine for yourself whether or not this is something that you would like to pursue and learn. The Nimzo-Indian is a response to d4, where you play knight f6, and pretty much no matter where your opponent plays here, which most of the time is going to be c4, you're going to play e6. Anything like the Jabava London, where you're going to play knight c3, or any other opening with just knight f3 and no c4 commitment is also going to be mentioned. This is primarily going to be in a sideline video or its own separate video. Right now, I'm just going to be mentioning the most popular things and the main ideas that you're going to face primarily 90% of the time. So once again, we have a kind of deviation here. A lot of people will just play knight f3 and transition into kind of a Catalan setup, in which case you have to play d5 and then bishop b4. This is fine as well. This is a slightly different opening, which I will also mention and explain. However, the ideas are pretty much the exact same. It's just the structure is going to be a little bit different. But most of the time, you're going to face knight c3, and this is where the Nimzo-Indian kind of shines. This is the starting position of the Nimzo-Indian setup, where you're going to play bishop b4. So let me first explain and help you guys understand the whole point of this setup. So first of all, going for the shortest possible route of castling. The only other way to castle as fast is to play g6 and bishop g7, so the King's Indian or the Grunfeld setup. But here you've developed your bishop, your knight, and you're ready to castle on the very next move. And your king is pretty much going to be safe. You've got that covered, and then you can start expanding and creating attacks and whatnot. Now, additionally, this is a very non-committal setup, so you've played e6, but you haven't dedicated a pawn to d5 or c5 or anything like that. So you still haven't kind of unveiled your plans yet, and white doesn't know exactly what you're going to go for because there are a lot of different ways to play this sort of opening. Also, you brought this bishop out, and now you're pinning the knight to the king. But additionally, you're able to play c5 without locking your own bishop in from staring into your own pawn. So c5 is a big thing that we play in a lot of these variations in the Nimzo-Indian defense. So c5 is a very popular move that we play in a lot of variations of the Nimzo-Indian defense. And it's very powerful because this bishop is already on b4. And so you don't have to worry about your bishop just staring into your own pawns. And last but not least, you're also preparing to destroy white's pawn structure by taking this knight at any moment. One thing to recognize is that when you play bishop b4, you have to be ready to lose this bishop by taking this knight. White gets the bishop pair, and a lot of the time you're going to end up doubling white's pawn structure, but your compensation lies in the fact that you have better development, your pieces are better placed, and your pawn structure isn't doubled. So let's look at some of the ways that white can play here. So the main move is e3. This is the most popular variation. This is where you're going to face maybe like 50 to 60% of the time. Additionally, there are moves like queen c2, against which we're going to just castle, and then you're going to get a3. That's the whole point of playing queen c2. You're just preparing to recapture this knight with the queen and not ruin your pawn structure. But white has to waste the tempo by playing a3. So instead of developing their piece, they're wasting a tempo and moving a pawn. So you're going to take the knight, queen recaptures, and then you're going to expand with d5. And from there, there's a bunch of deviations. We're going to discuss this in a video dedicated to the queen c2 variation. Now, there's also queen b3 instead of queen c2. This is considered subpar. This isn't as good as queen c2, and we can just respond with c5. Now here there are multiple moves. A3 is one of them, and this is something that we will discuss later on. But most of the time, people are going to take this pawn, after which you can develop with knight c6. You're going to get something like knight f3, and then you can play knight e4. So obviously attacking this knight is unable to capture because of the pin on the king. Bishop d2, take the bishop. No longer does your opponent have a bishop pair. And then you can capture the pawn, and here you're simply better. F5 is a popular move in these sort of positions to prevent either of these knights from jumping out and taking an active spot on the board. Now you might also encounter a very kind of normal way of developing with knight f3. This also transposes into the g5 variation. This is known as the Leningrad variation, and that pretty much is summarized by the fact that you're going to castle and then you're going to encounter bishop g5. So you pin my knight, I pin your knight. These positions transpose into each other, so there's no point in learning the specific move orders, and you're just going to respond with c5 and you're going to be completely fine here. Of course, every single variation I've showcased so far, I'm just briefly mentioning them, like just the tip of the iceberg. There will be specific videos on each and every single one of these variations that we will cover in comprehensive detail to make sure that you guys are going to be able to play this against anybody and be very much comfortable in every position. F3, known as kind of the anti-Nimzo, this has become very popular recently because it's an unorthodox way to play. It's very modern-ish. The point is to expand with e4 and just have a huge center. Against f3, we play c5. We're going to run into d5. The point is not to teach you guys a bunch of theory. This is just to demonstrate the sort of kind of examples of lines that you might face and whether or not you want to learn all of this stuff. The Nimzo is very much theory heavy, but you can also play it intuitively, so you don't have to memorize that much theory as long as you understand the ideas. However, if you're a top level player, of course, understanding theory is very important, and there are lines that can go 20, 25 moves deep in this opening. The immediate a3 is known as the same-ish variation. You take this knight, double the pawn structure. Now the justification for white is that, well, I have a bishop here. I no longer have to worry about your knight. For you, the compensation lies in the fact that these pawns are doubled, and the pawn structure is very much ugly. And also, white is undeveloped. c5, and you prepare to triple white's pawns, or you're going to have to fight against d5. But as you can see, a very popular motif in this opening is the move c5. This is something that we play pretty much every single time, and it is for good reason, because c5 is a great break in the center, and we don't want to commit a pawn too early in case we don't know where it's going to go. For example, in some lines, we want to play d6, and in some lines, we just want to avoid pushing this pawn altogether. Therefore, c5 is very handy because it's a useful move. It strikes in the center, and you don't really risk anything. And lastly, and of course there are a bunch of other sidelines, but kind of the other main move that you might encounter is bishop d2. This bishop d2 line is pretty interesting. The point is straightforward. White wants to play a3, have you capture the knight, and then recapture the bishop, pretty much just not ruining their pawn structure. You have a great response to this though, which kind of destroys this whole line. We're just going to castle very normally. After a3, we're going to capture this knight. Once the bishop recaptures, you have this knight e4 move. This knight e4 move sends the bishop to b4. And after that, you can play c5, and now this bishop is kind of stuck here. So after c5, and let's say this capture, you even have the move a5 right away, which pretty much forces the trade of bishops. So white's going to end up losing the bishop pair, and then they're also going to have these doubled pawns, which obviously is favorable for us. And we're just going to end up in a slightly favorable position. Now, there are obviously sidelines like knight c3, after which you're going to encounter something like the Jabava-London system, from where the ideas are going to be completely different, and the playstyle will be too. But you can play the Nimzo-Indian pretty much against anything, so this is a repertoire that will help you against any sort of setup, and it's going to be extremely solid. There's no real counter to the Nimzo-Indian. It's something that is employed by top players very frequently, and so you should be able to find great success with this opening if you are to study it thoroughly. But that pretty much sums everything up. This was a very, very quick episode just to get you guys introduced to the ideas of this opening. I hope you guys found this video useful. If you did, please consider checking out a video to my left. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in a future video.